Perfect. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this week's SEFS seminar. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Aerin Jacob. So Dr. Aerin Jacob is a conservation scientist at the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, also known as Y2Y. She designs, conducts, and communicates applied research to inform Y2Y and over 450 conservation partners across the region, including species at risk, land use in protected areas planning, and the role of science in law and policy. And she'll be talking today about connecting and protecting habitat from Yellowstone to Yukon. And with that, take it away, Dr. Jacob.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much, UW, for the invitation. I am really glad that to be able to do this. And it is one of the bright sides of this past year is that now we're all doing this on Zoom. So certainly my carbon footprint from traveling has gone way down, and that's nice in some ways. It's also really fun to be talking to this department because I actually know some of the people who are working there, and some of them played big roles in my life. So one of your professors, Laura Prue, was one of my first bosses as an actual conservation research when we were both at UBC, so it's great that she's here. And one of our grantees, I think, is in the audience, I think, as I was looking through the recipient list. Some other folks that I know through the Wilberforce Fellowship. I think John was going to attend today, so that's really nice. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we do at Yellowstone to Yukon. We work on a lot of different things over a big area that is changing fast. And I always struggle to know, what should I talk about? Should I tell them about what's happening with wolverines? Should I talk about our restoration work? Should I talk all the nitty gritty about impact assessment over the last 4 years and how I've developed many, many gray hairs over that? So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the things that I wish I had learned more about when I was in grad school. I certainly want to talk about the science and the role that science plays, but science isn't the only thing that makes conservation change. In fact, it takes a lot more than just the science. So partly the reason I've chosen to talk about the things I am today is they're at different scales. Some are very large and some are really, really local. It's a range of things that go from international conservation planning and the role of really big picture research to other aspects that we might not be thinking about necessarily as scientists, but I will argue that we should, as we learn to work differently with each other and for a more equitable future and certainly more effective conservation. But first, I want to mark a conservation scientist who had a big influence on me and his passing last week, and a name that is probably quite familiar to folks in your university, and that's Dr. David Chindler. He was professor emeritus at University of Alberta, and he was a very famous freshwater ecologist and scientist, extremely influential. And he died last, I think, Wednesday night. In addition to a lifetime of excellent research, I mean, the depth and the breadth of the research was incredible. I really admire his commitment to communicating about the work and that unflinching, dogged advocacy about why it matters for people, why it matters for those ecosystems. And it wasn't easy. He was also really generous to early career scientists. I reached out to him a number of times for advice when I was starting to make these forays into science advocacy and science policy. And it was pretty scary, especially when I was a PhD student. Still scary, but times change, you get better at it, you develop a thicker skin. And so I'm grateful for him, both for what he did in his career to make life better for people all around the world, especially in Canada, and for the tremendous legacy I think that leaves for people. If you haven't yet read about his life, I really encourage you to check out this long feature in the Tyee. It's online, it's in-depth, it's full of all kinds of fun stories. It's not just about the science. It's a really nice feature. So thank you very much, Dr. Chindler, for your incredible work. As well, before we get into some of the details about Yellowstone to Yukon and what we do, I think it's important that we all know a little bit more about the places that we live, work, and play. So I use this website, nativeland.ca, to help me learn about the Indigenous territories, the treaties, and the languages all across North America. And increasingly, all around the world, this map is really starting to fill in. It's an interactive map you can put in any place in the world or where they have this coverage, especially North America, and it tells you that kind of thing. So I am talking to you from my home in Canmore, Alberta, which is just outside Banff National Park, Canada's first national park. And this helps me learn that we are part of Treaty 7 territory, signed in 1877 between Queen Victoria and multiple nations. And this is the territory of the Blackfoot, the Ktunaxa, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina peoples, and that we all have responsibilities under those treaties. But just learning that is only one small step in a path, in a long process of reconciliation. This is a very live conversation in Canada right now. And I would argue, I think, needs to be increasingly so in other places, including in the US. If you haven't yet read this paper by Carmen Wong et al., came out a few months ago. It's in an open access journal called Facets. It actually gives specific ideas, really actionable things for individuals and for institutions to do on this path towards reconciliation. I think it would make a great journal club discussion, something for lab groups to think about, and also to track what they might do over the years to come. Okay, now we'll get into things a little bit more. If you're like me, the last year has felt a little bit like this. There's a lot of heavy stuff going on in the world. And even before the pandemic, there was a lot of tough stuff. We were looking at more than 1 million species at risk of extinction. We're on track for 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. And there's rising inequality. And that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff. So it's been a tough year, and it's in the context of really difficult conversations that we need to be having about how we live differently together and our relationship with the natural world. But I want to share some of the places where I find hope and courage. Some of the places where I work in Western North America, where people, despite different social, economic, and environmental problems, people care a lot, and where science, hard work, and collaboration are making things better for people and nature. And those big, huge problems about species loss, about climate change, about inequality, these come from decisions that are made at local, regional, national, and sometimes even global levels. So how do we make careful decisions? Sometimes we really need to walk a tightrope to make sure that there aren't really serious consequences for the things that we do. Sometimes there's limited information. Sometimes there's a wealth of information, and still questionable decisions are made. So I want to show you a little bit about the places where I work, mostly in the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains in North America are really unusual. One of the reasons that they're unusual is that they still have some of the species that we've lost in other parts of the continent. So this figure shows the historic ranges of large and medium-sized mammals, everything from a fox up to a moose. The places in red are where there's many of those overlapping ranges. Places in green, not so many. If you fast forward to when this work was done in 2004, you can see those shrinking ranges of these large and medium-sized mammals. So places with higher human influence were more likely to have those range contractions, and species were less likely to persist there. And the place outlined in black, that's where I work. That's the Yellowstone to Yukon region. So this is the stronghold for large mammals in North America. And yet, not everything is hunky-dory here. We've got a lot of problems that are happening in this region. There's also a lot of solutions, and I think that those solutions are applicable in other places in North America and around the world. So the first thing I want to emphasize is about animal movement and the need for animals to move. So this is going to be an animation that will show footprints. Those footprints represent the movements of one wolf, one very famous wolf. Pluie was collared not far from where I live in 1991. She seemed like an average wolf. Nobody thought she'd be different than the rest. And yet, over the next couple of years, she traveled more than 100,000 square kilometers, crossing more than 30 different political jurisdictions. So she went from Kananaskis, just south of Banff National Park, all the way through Alberta, through Montana, into Spokane, Washington, the Bob Marshall Wilderness, Montana, and back. And what that path showed is that effective conservation has to go beyond national, provincial, and state borders. We have to find a way to reduce the human-created barriers to movement. So Pluie's story intertwines with Wadawai's beginnings in the early 1990s. And to this day, her story and other animals like her inspires the work that we do. But it's not just about one wolf. It's not just about wolves. Other animals are doing this too. So this is going to be an animation about Ethel, the grizzly bear. And starting in 2014, Ethel got a collar and Ethel went for a very, very long walk. So she was about 20 years old when she left her main digs in Glacier National Park. She moved from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, all past Florence, Missoula, and Montana, eventually to Eureka near Glacier National Park again. That's quite the distance, especially for a species that can end up in negative interactions with people or in towns along the way. So think about all the different jurisdictions she's crossing, things like interstate highways, major city boundaries, municipal landfills, residential backyards, and even part of that was with her 2-year-old cub. So Ethel and other bears like her have to be able to not only move across that landscape, but avoid getting into trouble with people. And it's not just carnivores. So the last example I'm going to show is a mule deer, deer 255. She sure knows what it means to move. So not once, but twice did this mule deer travel across a massive expanse of land from southern Wyoming up to Idaho. That was in 2016. She traveled 250 miles, more than 400 kilometers. She did it again in 2018 while pregnant with twins. So that was so impressive that researchers actually wondered if it was a fluke the first time around. And she's done it multiple times, and other mule deer like her do as well. She's the record holder for the longest migration by a mule deer. So those examples are individual animals, but this scales up beyond individuals. So this is an example outside Yellowstone National Park that shows different elk herds. Each color is a different herd. You can see Yellowstone National Park, which is the brown sort of box or square in the middle, and then different jurisdictions around this. What I want you to take home, the take-home message here is that animals are moving across multiple jurisdictions. They are moving across federal land, the Forest Service and BLM, state land, which is in purple, and lots of private land, which is a sort of dotted, pale dotted colors. And they have to do that in order to survive. So in summer, the elk that are in Greater Yellowstone, they have to climb to higher elevations in and around the national parks. And that's where cooler temperatures and the summer rains keep grass greener for longer. But in winter, they retreat back to the foothills and the valley bottoms. And they do that to avoid the cold weather and the deep snow. So when elk and other ungulates can move freely across large landscapes, they grow fatter and they produce more offspring than their sedentary counterparts. So this is a really important, you can think about this as the engine of an ecosystem needing to be able to move. Some animals are migratory and have to do that. Other animals just move throughout their home ranges, or they might be dispersing to find a new place to live, to find mates. And it's crucially important, if you're thinking across these kind of boundaries, that you're thinking about collaboration across those boundaries. It's not enough to just work on one of those types of land. Collectively, we have to be collaborating together across those places. And that means agencies, universities, nonprofits, private landowners working together with a bigger picture vision. But a lot of animals around the world are having a lot of trouble moving. So probably like you, I like reading the scientific literature, and maybe like you, I can't keep up with it all. But when I read this paper the other day, I stopped cold. And actually, I talked about it to Canmore's Town Council yesterday, because I was talking to them about development in the town and how we need to be thinking about these global problems, but also how it plays out locally. And that's because this research paper looked at a global data set. 167 species around the world, aquatic and terrestrial. And they found they were looking at how human activities and habitat modification affects animal movements. Most of the data are from North America and Europe, but it really is all kinds of species, everything from a butterfly up to a moose and a great white shark. And they found that of this more than 700 cases, more than 2/3 of them represented a change in movement of 20% or more. And it varied depending on the species group and the circumstances. This figure on the right-hand side, green is the movement distance, and blue is the home range. So you can see for amphibians, and arthropods, the data is about movement, and that for amphibians, there was a overall decrease. For arthropods, there's an increase. And you look at birds, it's largely increasing. Fish, it's kind of all over the place. But for mammals and for reptiles, in Y2Y, we work largely on mammals, there is an increase in the amount that animals are having to move, and there's a decrease in the home range. So we know that animals need to move, and we know that human activities and habitat modification are having big, widespread effects. This is well studied. What else might be going on in this picture? What else do we need to be thinking about, especially as we consider solutions? This map shows both protected areas in blue, intact land, so places that don't have much habitat fragmentation in green, and non-intact land in yellow. And the message from this paper is about the connectivity of protected areas. How connected are different protected areas around the world? And they found that all around the world, only 10% of the world's parks are connected. And that's shocking. It should shock us. If you look at it on a country by country basis, as they did, you can see how things break down quite differently. Places along the x-axis, along the bottom, have very little of the protected areas are connected. Where I live in Canada, which is the second largest country in the world, known internationally for having rich forests, clean water, we only have 11% of this country protected, and 23% of that is connected. In the US, you're a little bit better on the protected side, but not on connectivity. 12% protected, 15% connected. So this is a huge factor in what's happening in terms of biodiversity loss, both the protection of the most critical habitat, core habitat, and whether or not those places are isolated. So I'm going to be talking today both about protection and about how we connect habitat. And both of those things need to be considered. I think in conservation, we often think more about habitat protection, but we do that at our long-term peril. We have to also be thinking about how these things are connected. And they're different. So that brings me to where I work. This is the Yellowstone to Yukon region. It is 1.3 million square kilometers, stretches from southern Wyoming all the way up to the northern Yukon. And this area is twice the size of Texas or Alberta. It's enormous. My job is to coordinate and conduct research across that area. It's just a little bit of work. It's 2 countries, 5 states, 2 provinces, 2 territories, and more than 75 Indigenous territories. So there's a lot of borders that we're thinking about here, human and natural. The Yellowstone to Yukon vision, which is the vision that if we are successful, what will life be like, is what's called a 100-year vision. And that's if we are successful, there will be an interconnected system of wildlands and waters stretching from Yellowstone to Yukon, harmonizing the needs of people with those of nature. And the reason that the Yellowstone to Yukon boundary is chosen is partly for geological reasons, watersheds, places that we know are connected or that need to be connected. And Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative is a joint Canada-US nonprofit organization. So when people talk about Y2Y, they might mean one of 3 things. They might mean the Y2Y region, they might mean the Y2Y vision, which many people can see themselves as part of, or Y2Y the organization. And we work to protect core habitats and to keep those areas connected or to restore lost connections. We work to inspire others to do similar work. And I'm going to get into a little bit about how we do that in a minute. So when Y2Y, the NGO, was first started in 1993, this map shows what the situation was like. There was about 9% of the Y2Y region with strictly protected lands. Those are places like parks and wilderness areas. But only 4% was conserved through other means. And that's where it's not necessarily an IUCN protected area category, but rather it's where something else might be prioritized, but conservation is an aspect of management there. It's like recreation zones or private conservancies. But by 2014, which was the last time we did this analysis, although there's a paper, whoops, this keeps advancing. Although there's a paper in revision right now that brings it up to date. By 2014, that had risen to 14% strictly protected lands. It's a huge increase. But the really massive advance here is in that 23% of other conservation measures. That's enormous. It's something like 300,000 square kilometers. It's the size of Norway. And that's the aspect of connectivity, because you can see that there are some big protected areas that are being created, especially in the northern part of the Waterway region, but they're still isolated. If we're not thinking about how they connect to other places farther south or east or west, we're not going to be successful in the long run. And that kind of work is not easy. This is by no means do I want you to think that this is Yellowstone to Yukon, the NGO, alone. We work with many, many other groups. Since 1993, when we first started, we've partnered with more than 450 other groups. And you can see some of them in this figure. That includes businesses, all levels of government, from municipal, Indigenous, federal, provincial, state, territorial governments, many other nonprofits, private landowners, scientists, both social and natural scientists, and more. And that's because if you're working on an area this large, on such complicated issues as both habitat protection and this fuzzy thing called ecological connectivity, you have to work with others. And it's really important that we might not agree on everything. In fact, there's a lot of things that these partners don't agree on, but we all agree on some aspect of that wide vision, that people and nature's needs both need to be considered together. So some of the things that we care about in particular are gravel bed rivers. So the top two pictures, the flood, not just the water itself, but the floodplain is really important. I won't be able to get into the details here, but I'd be happy to share some papers about that. Especially in British Columbia, we work, and some parts of the central Waterway region, we work on old growth forest. And these are some of the most critical areas for many endemic species where a lot of carbon is stored. I'll be talking about carbon in a few minutes. And we work on large, wide-ranging animals like grizzly bears, wolverine, and mountain caribou. Especially for grizzly bears, one of the reasons we work on them so much is that they're an umbrella species. Research has shown that if you can provide for the needs of grizzlies, because they co-occur with many other large and medium-sized mammals, you will inadvertently be protecting a lot of the needs for those animals. So it's a way for prioritizing the work that you do and making sure that you can be efficient in that work. It's not just because grizzlies are nice to look at. Let me tell you, I certainly like to be far away from them when I see them. But it's because they are that big picture umbrella species that allows us to think about both habitat protection and connectivity. I said we work on a lot of different things. There are 8 main themes. And across this huge and very busy landscape, we highlight and focus on local issues that have implications for the Waterway region as a whole. So that includes private lands, protected areas and public lands, advancing policies and practices that support the Waterway vision, encouraging human-wildlife coexistence, making roads safer for people and animals, assessing proposed development, and speaking out against it if it brings more harm than benefit. We work to restore degraded or damaged wildlife habitat, and particularly linkage areas, and we promote our vision for connected terrestrial and aquatic landscapes. Each of these themes has multiple projects. Some of them have been going on for 20 years. Some might have just started in the last year or so. I'd have to be at the university for the next month talking nonstop to tell you about all of them. So I've only chosen to talk about a few of them today. And as I said at the beginning, partly it's because science played a role, and partly because it's the kind of stuff that I wanted to know when I was a grad student or a postdoc. Tell me about the research, but tell me what it's doing. Tell me about the effect that it's having. And what did it take for the science to have an effect? So I'm just going to start with big picture about protected areas. Canada is a signatory on the Convention on Biological Diversity, along with 195 other countries. And that meant that we agreed to protect at least 17% of our land and fresh water by December 31st, 2020. And yet, I don't know if anybody can guess what Canada actually got to by December 31st, 2020. Let me tell you, it was not 17%. In fact, it was only 12%. I think we were at about 10 or 11% before this process started. So we didn't make a huge increase. It's disappointing, especially because we had 10 years to get ready. But in those 10 years, a lot of work was done by the federal government, by other groups, to identify some of the places that would be most important to protect. And it wasn't like we could just protect all of Baffin Island and call it good. We had part of the convention, and being party to the Aichi targets means that we had to think about well-defined targets, or well-defined goals, targets, and mechanisms to identify priorities. And that includes not just biodiversity, but the places that provide something called ecosystem services, the benefits that people get from nature. What I'm going to talk about next is focused squarely on the ecosystem services part, which is kind of funny for a conservation biologist to do. I spend most of my life thinking about wildlife. And yet the aspect of where do people get benefits from nature is a crucial part of this target. And I sat on a government science advisory group, and that was tasked with identifying possibilities for the federal government. And we were surprised that Canada didn't have maps about ecosystem services. Although we're a country that's known around the world for forest, water, we market ourselves like that, we didn't have maps showing where's the carbon, where are the most important places for fresh water, where's the nature-based recreation, things that matter for thinking about protected areas. And so what a few of my colleagues and I did, two others who sat on that advisory panel, and then a number of other colleagues did, was we set out to model and map where are some of the key benefits that people get from nature in Canada? Where do those things come from, and how do they get to people? We looked at many, many potential benefits to map. Then we considered doing flood protection. We looked at whether or not we could map pollination. We found that using publicly available data, we were able to do three. We could do those three well. That's carbon storage, both above and below ground, fresh water, and crucially, this is not just where the fresh water comes from, but where the human access and demand is for it. People use water for all kinds of things, including for drinking and for industrial purposes, crop irrigation, hydroelectricity. So this is agnostic of the conservation impact of doing those things. The first step is to identify where do we get these things, how are people currently using them. And then nature recreation. And again, this is not just about where nature supplies these marvelous places that many of us like to go for aesthetic beauty, for rejuvenation, for our physical and our mental health, but also how do we get there? Is it close to big urban centers? Is it close to airports? Is it near where people might be coming across the US-Canadian border, traveling by land to get there? Are they close to roads? How accessible are those places? So we mapped both aspects of that, both the supply and the demand. And there's a lot of modeling went into this. I'm only going to show you a few of the results. So for fresh water, using that combination of supply and demand, we got to something called provision, which is where not only did nature supply something, but people were there to get it, and they were able to get benefit from it. So the places in red, this scale is relative, it's from 0 to 1. Places in red in Canada are the places where that provision is most important. So you can see part of the Rocky Mountains, actually the area that I live in, emerges as being one of the most important. So too is the area north of Lake Superior. And that's because downstream of that are where many, many people in Canada live, in Southern Ontario and in Quebec. So those are high priority places if we're thinking about the protecting where people are actually getting benefits from water. We did recreation as well, and we looked at that combination of where does nature supply these things and where might people be able to get to them. If you look closely, you might be able to see some of the orangey areas in Southern Ontario and Quebec, so Eastern Canada, as well as in the Rocky Mountains and parts of British Columbia. Carbon was a little bit more straightforward because, unlike the other two, where nature supplies the carbon is also where we get the benefit, and that benefit accrues to people around the world. So for carbon, the total carbon importance is equal to where those things are found in the world. And surprisingly to me, as someone who spent a lot of her life working on forests and the carbon stored in forests, I was really surprised to see how much carbon is in the ground in Canada. We're talking about an order of magnitude difference. So that's why places like northern Manitoba, the area around Hudson's Bay, light up as being so important and a really crucial conservation priority. It doesn't mean that the big forests on the west coast of British Columbia or the boreal forest all across the country aren't important. It just shows us the differential in how much is actually stored in those Hudson's Bay lowlands, in those PT areas. So altogether, we added those things up. We found the combined benefits. And this is where the science and the actual application of it to real life differ a little bit. So we said, we're not going to choose one of these as being more important than the other. We're just going to consider them all equal and add them up together. And as we start to apply this work for land use planning, people might have different ideas about that. They might say, you know what, water is far and away more important to us here. We want to prioritize the places that are most important for providing water. And so then you'll start to see some of the maps would change. But just to start with, especially some of these new results about combining that demand and the supply in order to get provision, this is what we came up with. So what do you do next with that? Maps are wonderful, but where do you go next? In Canada, one of the things that people are becoming very, very interested in is carbon. And so we looked at the top 20% of stored carbon in Canada, and these are the areas in red. And actually, when I started to look at them in more detail, I realized that many of those red areas are also overlapping with places that have been identified by Indigenous people for conservation. So for instance, the Sahtu Land Use Plan, which is in the Northwest Territories, between Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake, those are places where people have gone through their own planning processes and have said, these are the places important for us for spirituality, for caribou, people very dependent on caribou and identify very strongly with caribou, and places that they have prioritized for conservation or for other types of management. Same with the Decho Land Use Plan, which is a little bit farther south. The Seal River Watershed is that area of northern Manitoba, just on the edge of Hudson's Bay, that lit up so strongly as one of the national carbon hotspots. And it's really cool to see that they have identified an area, I think it's something like 50,000 square kilometers, as important for Indigenous-led conservation. And lastly, Pimachiwanaki is an area around Lake Winnipeg, so just north of Wisconsin. And that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I think it's the first in the world, both for natural and for cultural reasons. So we're seeing here that places that have been identified by Indigenous people as conservation priorities, and they're huge, each of these is enormous, these are also places that have a lot of carbon. So that's the kind of information that might be used as these proposals go from ideas, or they go to implementing land use plans, looking for reasons to provincial, to federal governments about why they should be formally protected. And lastly, on this topic, one thing we've done next is to try to make sure that this research is going to be used and to be known about. So how do we ensure that research is both used and useful? And that's where I think researchers need to be spending a little bit of time before the publication of our papers to do more than having them just published behind a paywall somewhere. If you can publish them open access, that's one step, but it takes more than that. We took the step of making a fairly simple data visualization tool so that people could explore data themselves. And also people could download it and then overlay things that maybe they didn't want to make public. If you're planning an Indigenous protected and conserved area, you may not want to share those locations with the world, and that's okay. But if you can have access to this kind of information, then it can help you understand both how these different, just these three examples of ecosystem services line up with the things you care about. How does that also line up with things like logging, oil and gas, and other aspects of resource tenure? Because that's the area in gray. Most of these priority areas, half to 2/3 of them, overlap with places that are for existing resource extraction in Canada. So this kind of conservation gets complicated. We worked a lot. We did a lot of our homework to make sure that we would have media attention. You can't always plan that kind of thing. Sometimes you try really hard and it's just the wrong time. But we were really fortunate here, especially by identifying some of those things people needed to worry about, like water and proposed coal mining in the Rockies, which I'd love to come back and talk about another time. That's an interesting conservation challenge. So all this, we got a ton of media attention. There's probably more than 100 stories that were written about this work, including a lot of radio and, for me, very scary video, TV interviews about that. But publicity is not the same as actually implementing it. So, but it did lead to a lot of in-reach, including by federal and provincial, and hopefully soon territorial governments and other Indigenous governments that I haven't been in touch with before. And as we talked about this work, we wanted to make sure, is this kind of thing useful for you? Because we know it's not a done deal. You start, you do your best, and can always be improved. So we asked, is this kind of information useful to you? Why or why not? And the why not is really important. You need to be able to take that and say, okay, we did our best, but we're going to try to edit this, do better going forward. As well, what additional things would make it useful? What kind of tools would make it more usable for you? And make sure that that's incorporated in our planning as we go forward. And how can this kind of research best support decisions that we don't control, about land and water conservation, management, and planning? So these are just examples of a few layers that might go into very complicated land use planning that include many, many other things, including some that I might not have access to. And again, that's okay, things that other people are identifying. So it's exciting to work on that kind of thing, and unusual in some ways for a wildlife biologist. But this sort of work about ecosystem services, and especially finding that overlap among biodiversity and ecosystem services, is going to be a big part of international conservation going forward. This is the mission of what's called the Zero Draft. So it's before it actually becomes official for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I said when I introduced this segment that Canada was trying to protect 17% by 2020. We've committed to protecting 30% by 2030. And I remember that the US has as well, which is marvelous. Welcome. And so the mission, as it stands for the Zero Draft, is that it does include ecosystem services. So we're going to be sharing this kind of information so that people can use it around the world and to improve on it, because it's just one step. So that was one example about protected areas and how we use big picture research to help us identify areas that are important for both people and for nature. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer to home and talk about something that Y2Y is well known for around the world, which is road ecology and making sure that there's safer roads, both for people and for nature. This picture is taken not too far from where I live in Banff National Park. And if you've driven around different parts of the West, or maybe even different parts of the world, you might have seen structures like this. And this is a wildlife overpass. It's a land bridge that goes over the road, and it enables animals to safely get from one side of the road to the other. And that's because the road is fenced, and the road is fenced because the huge number of animal vehicle collisions that were happening before was a real problem for wildlife and a real danger for people. So when Canada was doubling the Trans-Canada Highway a number of years ago, the compromise was that they had to fence the road and put in these crossing structures. What you might not see as you drive over that road is that you're going over probably 8 times as many of these underpasses. And you need both in a landscape. Both are required in order to meet the needs both within a species and across species. And this is, although this by no means mitigates all the problems of roads, if I could stop one thing for in conservation, it would be stop road building, because it brings all kinds of problems. This does help to mitigate the problem of existing roads, especially as they're being widened. And do they work? In fact, they do. When these things were first built, it was, this is a real gamble by Parks Canada and others, because they didn't know if they would work. This was some of the first places in the world. And yet they set out to study it. And that's a crucially important part of these conservation, mitigation measures. They're experiments. We have to find out if they work. And if they don't, we need to fix them. So research over the years has shown that more than a dozen mammal species use these crossing structures. And this figure shows on the x-axis time, so going from 1997 when they were built to about 2015 when this research was published. Each of the different lines there shows you different types of these crossing structures. Some of them are overpasses, some of them are much smaller underpasses. There can be boxes, culverts, some of them are metal. And the picture really makes me happy. Doesn't just make me happy because it's an animal using them. It's because it's a long-lived animal, slow to reproduce, this grizzly bear, and she's teaching her cubs. So that's one of the things that shows us that animals do use these things, and they use them differently, because male grizzly bears will go under the road, but females much, much prefer to go over. Grizzly bears, moose, deer, and elk prefer high, wide, and short crossing structures, whereas cougars, black bears prefer long, low, and narrow ones. So you need all kinds of these in the landscape in order to meet the needs of multiple species and within a species. So you might imagine, though, that sometimes I'm in meetings where this kind of information about, it works for the animals, that's not enough for decision making. So often we talk about how much these things cost. This takes an economic toll. Wildlife vehicle collisions are not only scary, not only can hurt or kill people, and certainly animals, they're very expensive. This evaluation was done more than 10 years ago, so numbers have gone up since then. But they estimated that if you hit a deer, the average cost of that was more than $6,000 US, an elk upwards of $17,000, and a moose more than $30,000. And that doesn't include the human toll. I don't know if you've ever hit an animal or if you've had somebody that you love be in an accident. I have. And it's a really scary thing that stays with you for the rest of your life. So the good news about crossing structures is that they make sense economically because they pay for themselves within about 10 years. They make sense socially, and they certainly make sense ecologically. And the idea is catching on. I'm going to give you an example of one part of the Yellowstone to Yukon region where we're making big new progress, and it's really exciting for the people who are involved. This is an area of southern BC. It's right on the US border and the Alberta border. So we're talking about interprovincial and international connectivity. This is called the Elk Valley. In the Elk Valley, it's home to iconic wide-ranging animals such as grizzly bears, wolverine, elk, and bighorn sheep. And it's also one of the last areas where those animals move between Canada and the US. So the Elk Valley is not just important for its own sake, it ties together the Rocky Mountains at a continental scale. But it's also home to Highway 3, which is called the Crow's Nest Highway. That runs along British Columbia's southern border. So for many of the area's large mammals, Highway 3 is a mortality source, and it blocks movement at both local and international because of that transboundary nature, both of those scales. So there's about 200 collisions with large mammals each year in 40 kilometers between the Hosmer and the Alberta border. And that on average, costs society about $3 million Canadian a year. We know that highways cause 25% of elk mortalities and 30% of grizzly bear mortalities in the valley. Remember that grizzlies are, of course, a long-lived, slow-to-reproduce species. This is a big deal for those populations. And in fact, for wolverine and for grizzly bears, this road, this one highway, is part of fragmenting those populations. There is not genetic connectivity across those places. They're not moving across and breeding successfully. And the solution has been proposed for a while and is now starting to catch on, and it is crossing structures. We know that they work. We know that they reduce collisions. They pay for themselves within 10 years. They reduce animal mortality, and they improve connectivity. And here's where they're putting them. So this is a project that's a partnership among the BC government, another NGO called the Miastakis Institute, another called WildSight, researchers, including through the Libre Arrow Fellowship, which is a postdoctoral fellowship in Canada, and Y2Y. So the map here, you can see Highway 3, the black line, and there's different towns. Those green dots are where underpasses are proposed. And remember, we need both in a landscape. And orange is for one overpass, one big overpass. It's called the Alexander Michel Overpass. And this corridor has been called the mother of all wildlife corridors in North America. Importantly, it's not just in any old place. The land surrounding that proposed overpass has been protected by the Nature Conservancy of Canada and by Teck Coal, a coal mining company that's operating in that area. And this is part of this larger Safe Passage initiative. And together, if these things are implemented, it will be part of securing this internationally important corridor. There's more than 1,600 kilometers of modified regions in the roads in the Y2Y region, and that's really exciting. They are in various stages. Some of them are in very early stages of thinking about these. Some have already been constructed, and they're into monitoring phases. That's really exciting. Lest we think that it alleviates all the problems with roads, let me remind you that it doesn't. But for roads that we currently have and that need to be mitigated, this is a solution that works. The next example I'm going to talk to you about really briefly is something that's a little bit different for scientists. And it's about the social, cultural, legal, and policy landscape about relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And we're all called to explore what reconciliation means to us individually and for our communities and our economies. But how do we do this? We have to make space and make it in what's called an ethical way, an ethical space, for people to get to know each other, for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to learn together about this, to build listening and to build dialogue. And this includes scientists. So what we've been doing at Y2Y is for one part of the Yellowstone to Yukon region in eastern BC. It's called the Upper Columbia. This is a really important area for us. It's a critical stronghold for grizzly bears and for wolverine. And this area is changing fast. So ethical space, if you're not familiar with it, you can read about it more in the Indigenous Circle of Experts report, 2018 report about conservation. And it's a process that acknowledges the different ways that Indigenous and Western cultures view the world. And that one is predominantly written and one is predominantly oral. But there's being an ethical space isn't about making assumptions or about charging ahead. It's about creating a place for knowledge systems to interact, and importantly, with mutual respect, kindness, generosity, and other important values. So Y2Y's role here is that we convene people. We've brought together different groups, particularly Indigenous leaders in this realm, for a series of dialogues. And it is one of the great things about being online. We've had an enormous amount of interest in this. Hundreds of people are coming to these workshops online. We've held 4, and they're all available to view online through y2y.net/ethicalspace. We're arranging for our 5th one very shortly, and they're on various topics, importantly, including Indigenous law. And what does that mean for conservation, for wildlife management, for natural resource extraction? So I didn't get to talk to you about any of our work on habitat restoration, including in parts of the US, in Idaho or in Washington. I didn't talk about our policy work, including on species at risk or wildlife corridors internationally. Some of our work to create new protected areas, particularly some really exciting ones led by Indigenous people, or some of the fun field work we're doing about when I actually get away from my computer and get to go and have fun looking for wolverines. So I'd love to chat about any of that as well. And you're welcome to put questions in the chat or we can talk in the one-on-one after. Just as I start to wrap up, I'll say that one of the most fun parts of my job is working with other wildlife professionals. And I love being able to support early career scientists and conservationists. So Y2Y has a number of grants that people can check out if you work in the Y2Y region on conservation. We have internships every summer. And actually we're hiring a couple of positions right now, a bit at a more senior level, but you never know down the road. And I'll close by just saying that there's this global shift towards large landscape conservation. Y2Y is just one of many large landscape initiatives around the world. And in a time when there's a lot of dire news stories that spotlight the global loss of biodiversity, the impacts of climate change, there really is a vibrant bottom-up conservation movement emerging all over the planet. And this is looking beyond national parks, it's looking beyond strict lines on maps, and it's trying to connect and sustain the areas where wildlife live and where they move freely, how we can have clean water and other ecological benefits, and working lands to support sustainable communities where Indigenous cultures thrive. And I think that that's really important for us all to be doing. Science plays a big role in that, but science isn't the only thing. So as you are doing your work, no matter if you're at the beginning of your career or thinking about easing into retirement, I'd really encourage you to question statements like this. Is it enough to just keep your head down? Will someone else really speak up? Do the data really speak for themselves? I think it's more important than ever for us all to be a voice about our science, what it means, what the impact is. And although that can be hard, it's crucial that we support each other in doing that. It's crucial that we learn to do it well so that we're not extending beyond our expertise, so that we don't run headlong into problems that we or other more experienced people might have been able to predict, so that we can make a difference. But I'd really encourage you to think about these things and to work with others, including at the university. Universities have so many resources for these kind of things to learn and to support others as you start to do this. I hope that if we do that, that this kind of large landscape conservation will be more and more effective going forward. And I think we as scientists and the science itself will be better for it. So I'm happy to take questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat. If there's things we didn't get to, check out y2y.net or send me an email. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very much on behalf of SEFS, Dr. Jacob. And yeah, like Dr. Jacob mentioned, yeah, thank you for the inspiring seminar. I agree with Jen Weiss in the chat there. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A or the chat.
I think a lot about, gee, should I have talked more about work we're doing in the US and a lot of the work we're trying to do on roads, on especially private land conservation in Montana and Idaho, our work around Wyoming, and especially those transboundary areas. Lots of fun stuff on habitat restoration, some brand new projects working with tribes there as well. But there's only so much you can do in 45 minutes, so wasn't able to fit all those things in. But yeah, I think there's a question.
Yes, there is, from Laura Prue. Fantastic talk. Y2Y seems especially effective as a conservation organization. Are there particular secrets to its success that you can identify?
Thanks, Laura. Are there particular secrets? It varies from place to place and differing circumstances. Certainly collaboration is critical, is absolutely critical. And it's hard, right? Like it's hard to work with many different groups, especially some that do not like each other. But that commitment to speaking up for what the science says. Lots of organizations say that they're science-based. It was important to me when I started at Y2Y to say, if research showed that grizzly bears were not the umbrella species, if we should be protecting frogs, would we shift? And it was really important to me that the organization leadership said, yes, we would. So I think a big one is understanding big picture science, saying plainly what it means and being courageous about that. That doesn't mean being naive about how you communicate it, when you communicate it, or who the best spokespeople are. And I think going forward, one of the things that we and others will be doing more and more of is understanding that conservation science and conservation have not served all people equally. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of equity, inclusion, and justice. So I think that the 25 years from now, the success that we will have will be dependent on how well we and others are able to shift to adapt to that more.
All right, looks like we have some more questions here. Here's one. Recent work on pandas in China has questioned how adequately umbrella species works as an effective conservation philosophy. Any comments?
That paper, I think it's a paper, it rings a bell. I was actually talking about pandas earlier today for some reason. It's in the Rocky Mountains. Work has repeatedly shown that grizzly bears are the best umbrella species. They are certainly not the only ones to work on. And in the boreal forest, caribou are. However, I think that can, both the focus on large wide-ranging animals can alienate some. We need to be thinking more about ecosystem-based work going forward. I didn't talk about our work on gravel bed rivers, other than to say that we're doing it. That's a different lens that we're taking in some places, and I think that they're complementary together. So I don't think that Y2Y or other groups that use umbrella species as one of their guiding principles I don't think that will shift anytime soon. But I think we need to be adding other tools in the toolbox and identify where does the umbrella species concept, where does it not fit? My guess is that will probably be more places in farther north in the Y2Y region, partly because they're right now more intact than others. So yeah, it's a good question and one we're thinking about, and welcome more engagement on that. But I think it'll be more the adoption of additional guiding principles.
All right, we have another question here. Such a great talk. How do we balance global goals for protection with land use by Indigenous populations so as not to engage in green grabs?
Yes, crucial question. Thanks, Dan. And so I would say that it's Yeah, when I think about big conservation advances in the past about land protection, a lot of it's been at the expense of people, and often Indigenous people. I live next to Canada's first national park, and Indigenous people were excluded from it for probably 100 years. Certainly the case in Yellowstone as well. So that is a big topic. What YDY does when working with Indigenous people is it's Indigenous led. These are conversations that people where we identify mutual interest in an area, often mutual concern about the various threats, and work to if we can provide information, if we work on government relations or rallying other advocates for those places. The idea about green grab and kicking people off of lands, tying land up, that's a pervasive idea that's out there, and it's worrisome to me because I don't quite know how we deal with it. It's not what we do, and trying to make sure that people understand that. But I think part of it is that willingness to, might be getting to the initial question that Laura had about secrets. It's that willingness to sit down and have longer conversations and to hear people's concerns, and that. So I will. Just to wrap up this sort of rambling answer, I'll say that many of the Indigenous groups that we work with have an extraordinarily strong conservation ethic. The Decho land use plan identified initially, I'm going to say it was more than 70% of their territory they wanted protected, like protected strictly. And government said, no, gosh, no. Same thing happened in the Peel region. So Indigenous people themselves are identifying very large percentages of protection. And then other areas for use, where we still need to make sure that use is sustainable. This ideas of like half Earth and nature needs half. They're not about just protect 50% and do what you want with the rest of it. It's about protecting what sustains life on Earth and then sustainably using the rest. And I think it requires all of us to be reevaluating the resources that we use.
All right. Let's see. Another question. It's sort of I guess a bit of an open-ended question, but what are sort of the top sort of tips and tricks for Y2Y to make cross-border, in particular like U.S.-Canada cross-border conservation work?
So one section as I was putting this together, and the section I took out actually addresses that, and it's this massive gap in policy. There are no international guidelines for connectivity. What are wildlife corridors? What do they mean? How do you actually implement them? And in this policy vacuum, up until I think it was maybe in the fall, the IUCN produced the first global standards, the first global guidelines. And YDY's president, my boss, Dr. Jody Hilty, who literally wrote the book Corridor Ecology, is the lead author on that. So it's the first time we, as a global community, have had guidelines that can apply all around the world. They'll need to be applied, circumstances will dictate how they should be applied through states, provinces, and nations. But that's a big, big reason why we haven't had that kind of overarching policy. So what a corridor means in a town like Canmore is very different than what it might mean for a state or for international areas. So that's one. The other one is people need to actually meet each other. One of the funny roles that YDY plays is often we're introducing people within their own governments. Like the people in transportation don't talk to the people in environment, don't talk to the people in forestry. And that's even within one province or one state. And then another role that we play is often introducing people across borders, so that rather than me going and talking to a group of engineers, I'm not an engineer, and then going to talk to another group of engineers, it's introducing them together, and they understand the challenges and the opportunities that they would have for things like implementing crossing structures. Same thing with people dealing with human-wildlife conflict. Our role is often facilitating those kind of collaborations, and then we're not required. One of the important things to know is when you're needed and when you're not needed.
All right, thank you. All right, are there other questions? Chat or in Q&A? Okay, well,
If you think of more later, you can always send me an email. I'm pretty Googleable. And the Y2Y website has tons of information. We share stories about the work that we and our many, many partners are doing. Yeah, lots of staff who are working on different things. If you want to chat more about work in Idaho or Montana, happy to put you in touch with some of our US staff, or as we go forward, different projects we're working on. Always happy to chat about research ideas too. You know, if you're got grad students, postdocs, thinking about a Smith Fellowship or a Lieber Arrow Fellowship, do get in touch.
All right. Well, on behalf of SEFS, once again, thank you very much, Dr. Aerin Jacob, for your time today and for your excellent and inspiring talk.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.